Morning, everybody. Where we were last time is I had just pointed out that most of the endangered species now are threatened because of habitat loss, 80% of them, and 90% of those, so fully 70, odd percent of the total, 72%, are habitat loss due to agriculture. And so that is, of course, concentrated in the agricultural regions of the world that include Eastern North America and most of Europe and rain-fed Asia and so on. Now, the dominant, there are two methodologies to figure out extinction rates. Or possible to forecast extinction rates. One is complicated and involves modeling the biology of the organisms. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And the second is what I would call phenomenological. And it's based on this empirical relationship, which is amazingly repetitive across the world for different kinds of organisms in different places between the area of a habitat for a species, or like some habitat, and the number of species in it. So the simplest way to get this is to look at all the different islands in the South Pacific or in the Caribbean and to plot the number of bird species on the islands. This was really popular among ecologists in the 1960s, because it just meant traveling from island to island and bird watching. Okay, so it was like, it's like everybody wanted to do it. So there's a huge amount of it done. These are people who like to collect lizards, and they would go collect all the lizards, catch all the lizards on all the islands in the Caribbean or in the South Pacific, right? So the point is, there are a lot of these data sets, or there are plant lovers who would do the same thing, wander around and do sort of recreational botanizing on islands or on alpine zones. You go all the mountainous regions and climb the mountains and hang out. I mean, who doesn't like that, right? So anyway, the thing is that, like many phenomena, on a log plot, the distribution, the relationship between area and the number of native species is a straight line. Now, for those of you who have done math a long time ago, a log plot here, instead of plotting the normal number line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you plot powers of 10. 10 to the 0th is 1, 10 to the 1st is 10, 10 to the 2nd is 100, and you put equal spacing between the different powers of 10. So each tick mark here on this axis is an island 10 times bigger than the previous tick mark. You see that? 10 to the 0, 10 to the 1st. So the actual distance and area between the tick marks is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? The further up you go. So this is 100 million square kilometers, and this is only 10 million square kilometers. So the difference is 90 million square kilometers, right? You do the same thing for the number of species. So 10 species, 100 species, 1,000 species, 10,000 species. And the dots form a straight line on that figure. Now, what does that mean? Well, mathematically, if you put this back in normal units of area, not logarithm units, the number of species in normal units equals a constant times area to the zth power, where z, amazingly, for all groups is really close to a quarter, 0.25. Now, let's unpack what that means. This constant is unit dependent, but let's suppose area is measured in square kilometers, okay? So if you put 1 in for A, you take 1 to any power and you get 1. 1 to the second power is 1, 1 to the third, 1 times 1 times 1 is always 1, right? And so 1 times the constant, the number of species on a unit area habitat is equal to the constant, okay? That's where the constant comes from. It's empirical. And what you do is you extrapolate from this thing and you say, okay, a unit area 10 to the 0, that constant here is about 100 species. Okay, that's how you get that. So let's suppose that the constant, just suppose, is 10. 10 species on a 1 square kilometer island. That would be approximately true in Europe of tree species, for instance. If you went to a 1 square kilometer wood in Europe, you'd have about 10 tree species present, order 10 tree species present. Now you take the area to the 0.25 power, which means you take the square root of the square root of area. So if the area is 1 square kilometers, the square root of the square root of 1 is still 1, and there would be 10 species you'd expect. If area was 10 square kilometers now, so 10, or let's make it 100 square kilometers, so it's now equal roughly to the size of a degree of latitude and longitude on the side, then the square root of the square root of 100 is, well, the square root of 100 is 10, and the square root of 10 is just over 3, because 3 times 3 is 9, right? So it's just about 3 point something times 10. So you'd expect about 30 species. And if you went fully 100 times bigger than that, let's suppose the habitat was 10,000 square kilometers. Well, the square root of 100 of 10,000 is 100, and the square root of 100 is 10. So the square root of the square root of 10,000 is 10. 10 times the constant, which is 10, means you'd have about 100 species. So that's the way you use this thing. And so what that would say is if the constant was 10, if there were 10 species on a 1 square kilometer island, that means if you went to a 100 square kilometer island, you'd have about 30 species. And if you went to a 10,000 square kilometer island, size of the state of Texas or California or something, you'd have around 100 species, right? And that's the way this thing is bending over. You see that? So it's the square root of area times an empirical constant, which is equal to the number of species on a unit area habitat patch. All right, so how can you use this thing? Well, you can use it by saying, well, let's take different biomes and ask what fraction of the area was lost? How much of the area was lost historically? And we can look at how many species there are, if none have gone extinct, or how many there are. And we can look at the size of the area after we've converted most of the habitat to agriculture. And we can plug in the new value of the land area and figure out how many species the place should now have, okay? And the difference between the pristine habitat, which was, say, 10,000 square kilometers, and the new habitat, which is maybe 100, is the difference between the number of species we expect, and the difference is equal to the number of species we expect to lose. So in our example, a 10,000 square kilometer habitat should have 100 species, and a 100 square kilometer habitat should have 30 species. That means we'd expect to lose 70 of the 100 species because of the loss of almost all the habitat. 10,000 square kilometers, the size of the state of Texas or California, down to 100 by 100 kilometers. Okay, 100 square kilometers rather, 10 by 10. So what's going on here? So that assumes that the relaxation to the new value after you cut down the habitat will happen very quickly. Or it assumes that when you talk about that difference, what you're really talking about, these are extinctions that you expect eventually to happen, okay? You expect them to eventually go back to this relationship because this relationship is so ubiquitous everywhere. Forces must eventually force it back. Now, it turns out that we know that it takes a long time after you've destroyed habitat to relax back to this relationship. And I'm just going to jump forward here. Dave Wilkove here at Princeton, for example, has made a study of this in different places. And so, for example, 99% of the forest in Puerto Rico, loss of 99% of the forest, okay? 99% of the forest was whacked. And so far, we've lost 7 of 60 bird species. Now, if you do the square root of the square root and do all that stuff, that's not enough species to have been lost. We should have lost more than half of them, more than 30, and we lost 7. And so the idea is, if you look at every island in the Caribbean, the different islands adhere to this relationship. And so the idea is that if you wait long enough, you'll eventually snap back to this relationship. But so far, we've only lost 7 of the large number we should have lost, all right? And so that's the problem. Now, if you read somewhere, this is just a little guide about how you use that. The old species, like in Puerto Rico, is equal to the constant, which is the number of, say, bird species in a unit area, times the old area of Puerto Rico to the 0.25 power, the square root of the square root of the area of Puerto Rico. The new species, we expect the same constant times the new area, which is 100 times smaller, and the square root of the square root of that. And so the new species over the old species is equal to that, okay, which turns out to be a simple relationship. Now, I'm not going to expect you to reproduce that calculation, but if you're a person who likes to do calculations, there's a simple little formula you can use that's probably true. It's probably correct. If we were to somehow whack the forest of Puerto Rico, freeze human behavior for all time, and it might take thousands of years, eventually that little relationship there will probably give you the right number of extinctions. But in the last couple hundred years, since we started really whacking Puerto Rico, it has only produced a fraction of that. All right. And so when you read a terrible extinction number, you'll often hear about an extinction debt. Extinction, we're committed to a certain number of extinctions, words like that. And those words come from this relationship. Extinctions we eventually expect, but haven't occurred yet. And that means expect if this relationship continues to hold, and if the area that we now have doesn't change. All right. And that turns out to be the biggie. If the area of the habitat doesn't expand again. All right. So that's one methodology. And I showed you this, I think, in the first day or the second lecture, which shows the business as usual problem with anthropogenic mass extinction. As we'll see, agricultural expansion to feed a humanity that has higher and higher demand for calories, both because there are more people and because those people are richer and want more protein in their diets, which takes more land area to produce. We'll do all of that in just a minute. Means that we might lose all 1.6, we might have to expand agriculture by something like 1.6 billion hectares. And if that comes at the expense of tropical forest, and you put that in one of those little diagrams, like I just showed you, that little formula, we end up with a loss of 60% of rainforest species. All right. And that's a lot. That's like 1 million species. Okay. That's a huge amount. And so this is an interaction. That's where that number comes from. And that's an interaction between the food problem and the biodiversity problem. Most of biodiversity is now, that is threatened because of past agricultural expansion. If we meet growing food demand in the future, by, for instance, doubling our cropland area, we're going to have, the only place left that's rain-fed is rainforest. really speciose, and we'll lose like 60% of the species on Earth if we do that. A lot. So the solution is not to increase the agricultural land. That's the solution. And as we'll see, that's feasible to do. We have to figure out how not to increase the agricultural land. Now, the other big threat is with climate change. And the forecasts with climate change are done in a variety of ways, but most of the climate change forecasting tries to do mechanistic modeling of the effect of climate on species. Many species, most species, have climatological range boundaries. They live, for instance, up to the frost line if they're a tropical tree, and then they can't stand frost, so that's where they quit. Or they persist until it gets too droughty, rainfall gets too low, and then they drop out, right? Or they, if they're, say, northern species adapted to cold, they spread south until conditions are better and they like it better, but there are other species that aren't cold adapted and are better as a result at competing in the warm places. Basically, southern and it is high temperature and high rainfall barriers are determined by competition. You can't go further towards the hot or further towards the wet because there's somebody there who's weak at standing up to climate, but really good at competing, right? Tropical trees will grow 5 meters in a year in height, okay? You whack a tropical forest, you come back 6 months later and everything's 3 times your height already. And whereas dry and cold barriers are typically climatological, okay? And so you can figure out how habitats are going to move around and which species can keep up and which ones can't. And that gives you a prediction that business as usual climate change by itself, with no other changes, would whack 33% of species. And so that's a lot of loss. 60 together with 33 from the two is just a lot of loss, okay? The first one done primarily by that phenomenological method, the species area relationship. The second one done primarily by biological sort of modeling of species, but both of them are actually done both ways. And the two methods give similar answers. And you shouldn't put too much stock in that because we're doing mechanistic biological modeling and it didn't produce the phenomenological relationships that have been observed again and again and again. Well, you just keep adjusting your model until it does, because you're not going to be stupid and publish something that doesn't work, right? So those aren't independent statements, but nonetheless, the two methods give about the same answer. The solution is to limit climate change while not expanding agricultural land. That's the way you limit this. And then if you look across the world, the sort of extinction debt, if we eventually relax back to the number of species we expect, given historical agricultural expansion, we're going to lose about 11% of the species on Earth, right? Now we can probably do better than that, but that's where the numbers in this slide came from. Okay. Any questions about that? There's a lot there. And you know, how seriously you take this depends on how seriously you take the methodology. I certainly wouldn't bet my retirement income on the exact size of these numbers. But you would be, I think, probably unwise to assume that the numbers aren't big, given the relationships that are here, right? One other problem with waiting for extinctions in the future, talking about extinctions that are yet to happen, of course, is that humanity does change its behavior, and the amount of habitat for species is likely to change in the future. And one of the most compelling sets of data on this comes from a thing called the environmental Kuznets curve. This is a curve that is dominant in economics, was discovered by economists. And what you plot is per capita GDP and some measure of environmental damage on the vertical axis. I think Kuznets first did this for air pollution. And what Kuznets discovered was that at first, when you start to increase per capita GDP, everybody is like out busily building jobs and factories and infrastructure, and they just don't care about air pollution at first. You just belch it out. So the air pollution gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And at some point you wake up and say, holy, this is terrible here, okay? We've got lots of income, or at least enough to start really worrying about the health of our children and stuff. And then you clean it up, okay, down the other side. Now, it turns out that the forest data that we have looks like we're sliding down the descending portion of the Kuznets curve in the world already. As countries get richer, the amount of agricultural land actually goes down, not up. And you release land back to native habitat. This is really obvious if you fly from here to anywhere west of the Mississippi. Because when you look out the window, you'll discover that, if you do it at random intervals, set up a little random counter for your timing and look out, or do it for regular intervals, look out every 10 minutes and say, is there forest directly beneath me or not? You'll discover that the answer is yes, about 3/4 of the time, right? And if you had flown in an early plane in 1912, the answer would have been something like less than 10% of the time. All of that land has been abandoned. It's abandoned agricultural land because we got too rich and everybody started, doing whatever they're doing, selling insurance or something. And they got sick of taking care of their pastures and they just released them. If you go walking in the woods around Princeton, you come across stone walls all over the place. If you walk through the forest, there's only 2 places I know around Princeton where if you walk through the forest, the ground all of a sudden becomes mounds and then pits, mounds and pits. And those are old tip-up mounds of trees that have fallen over and pulled the root system up, and they create a hole. And then when the thing decomposes, a mound. And the reason that there are only 2 places like that is that the land was all cut down and plowed, and the tip-up mounds were plowed flat. So the 2 places, there's a place in the Institute Woods where you can go, where there's a beech forest that was never cut down. And immediately you go there and there are giant trees, it gets really dark, and there's hummock and hollow tip-up mounds. There's another place in a place called the Witherspoon Woods that you can go to. It's kind of got wrecked though, because one of the windstorms that came through knocked down a lot of the big trees, but the ground still looks right and the species mix is still right. So the point is that we're now sliding down in many societies this way. Some are still climbing, but most of the data shows the opposite side. So across Latin America, for instance, the total amount of forested area is actually increasing, not decreasing, despite what you read. It is still the case that pristine rainforest is being cut down, but more agricultural land is being abandoned than new pristine rainforest is being whacked. That doesn't mean that it's good necessarily for the species, because it takes a long time before a rainforest gets big enough to actually maintain the species that were historically in it. But it is the case that all around Latin America already, people are abandoning subsistence agriculture because the economy is already too good. And you can see this all over the place. If you actually do any ecotourism travel anywhere, you should really go. And if you can, especially if you can speak the language and talk to the local people. And if you go to a place, I mean, there are so many places, especially if you go to Central America and there's a dry forest and there are ranchers there. It's a common thing. People go to a place called Guanacaste, or they go to the Azuero Peninsula in Panama or someplace. And it's a really common place to hang out because there's no rain, it's nice and sunny, and there's, good birds and yada, yada. But if you talk to the local ranchers and you'll say, what's going on here? You'll notice they're all old. And they'll all say, oh, the young people left and they all go to the city and no one is here to take care of the pasture anymore. And so it looks so bad. All the trees are coming in. I'm too tired to take them out. It's like that, right? You get too rich to mow the lawn. That's what goes on, right? So the point is that the habitat comes back and that extinction debt is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. So there's a lot we can do even to erase the 11% if we choose to do so. That 11% on the previous slide assumes we're not going to get smart enough to ever contract the agricultural land we've already got. And I think we're going to get smart enough. All right, so maybe that 11% isn't really 11%. But nonetheless, if you take all those future threats, and we aren't smart enough to like stop climate change and to freeze agricultural land, maybe even reverse it, then this historical extinction rate, which is already 100 times higher than the background, is going to get another 100 times higher. And then you really get into the territory of a mass extinction. Elizabeth Colbert's book, the sixth extinction, yeah, is about that. Now, why is it the sixth extinction? Here's just a couple of diagrams. So I showed you this one, I think, on the second lecture too. These are estimates from biological models of different groups about how fast species ranges can move, given how much species move in their lifetimes, what they're capable of. And as their northern or southern range limits or eastern or western range limits change because the climate has changed, where the climatological boundaries are, they've got to keep moving to keep ahead, to keep in their zone in which they're dominant competitors and able to survive. And if those zones are moving faster than the species can move, they're in trouble. And this diagram, if you disentangle it for different scenarios, shows that some species don't move fast enough. And we've seen this before. During the cool down, during the last glaciation in Europe, it was getting colder and colder and colder. And the trees that were almost the same as the tree species around here and in East Asia were moving south as the climate cooled. And then they ran up against the Alps and the Pyrenees, which are running east-west. And to climb over the mountains, it had to get even colder. So they were screwed and they got squeezed against the Alps and most of them went extinct. So Europe has 10 times fewer tree species than we do because of that. They couldn't move fast enough to keep up with the climate change and they ran into a barrier. And so there's a lot of this kind of modeling that goes into the number that I showed you on the previous slides, or a couple, I think it's just the previous slide, two ago, where that's where at 33%. That's one of the factors that goes into that kind of modeling. Now, where does the sixth extinction come from? Well, you probably know there have been 5 titanic mass extinctions in geologic time that are talked about. This plot doesn't show them very spectacularly because it measures genera. Each genus consists of many species. And so to lose a genus means you lose every species in the genus. Nonetheless, if you look for a dip, here's the most recent dip. This goes from today back to the beginning of the Cambrian, over 500 million years ago. That dip there, if you put it in species numbers, means 75% of the species on Earth went extinct. That's the KT mass extinction. And if you count back, there have been 5 biggies. Now, the only one that we're unequivocally, well, I'm going to say unequivocally, where the scientific community has a consensus about what caused it, is the KT boundary, this one, the one in which the non-bird dinosaurs got killed. In that extinction, every animal on land over 25 kilometers, or over 25 kilograms went extinct. They like all died, okay? Now, you probably know that the reason for their death was the collision of the Earth with a a 10-kilometer diameter asteroid or comet that hit the Yucatan and left a crater, which is now buried by sediment, but is imaged like crazy. And it's 180 kilometers in diameter. And that thing slammed into the Earth with an energy like the combined nuclear arsenal of the entire world times 10,000, released it all at once. That's bad when that happens, okay? And it's bad in a whole lot of ways. And so all of the big stuff just got killed. Now, what killed it? Well, you do get a shock wave that goes at just about the speed of sound that travels around the world, and it'll kind of chop everything off at the knees. But if you're in a valley, you know, it kind of passes over the top, right? Turns out, though, that it also creates tidal waves if it's in the ocean, and this one was close enough to the ocean to create tidal waves. You can measure from the sediment how big the tidal waves were. The ones that hit the Louisiana coast were about 7,000 feet tall. Now, that's a big wave, okay? Like a really big wave. And those are moving at like 500 miles an hour, okay? They're really going fast. So that's bad, but they don't go inland very far. You can see where the sediment peters out. Turns out that the rock in the area was limestone and gypsum, had a lot of carbon in it. And so vaporizing that carbon put a whole bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, and also made acid rain and acidified the oceans and sort of screwed things up for a long time. And that extended the extinctions for millennia, not just all at once. But it turns out that really big killer was that it ejected 20,000 cubic kilometers of material so high in the atmosphere that it had to re-enter, either exit the Earth's orbital, go into orbit, but most of it re-entered, parabolic arc back in. And when it re-enters, it's like a shooting star, okay? It's glowing red hot, the heat of re-entry. And 20,000 cubic kilometers worth of shooting stars, all on the same day, turns out to cook the Earth. The amount of energy hitting North America that afternoon was 1,000,000 watts per square meter, all right? So surface temperature climbed something at 400 degrees Celsius. So unless you were in a burrow, you were done, okay? So that's mostly what killed the big things. Also, that dust thing goes in the atmosphere and it blocks the sun for a whole growing season. So then a lot of things starve. So those are mass extinction events, and that has absolutely nothing to do with this course other than that we don't want to have another one. You know, as a species, we actually spend a fair amount of money figuring out ways to deflect asteroids. There's just been a recent test, and it's a sensible thing to do when you think about it. Low probability event, but if it happens, it's really bad. So it turns out if you can detect an asteroid far enough away, you only need this littlest of nudge to get it to miss, okay? And so there are all kinds of ways to get it to move. And so the governments of the world are actively working on that, an asteroid deflection and comet deflection apparatus. Nonetheless, still the most likely way that you're gonna know that something big and bad like that has happened is to one day look up and see this fireball coming over the horizon, all right? So we're still vulnerable as a species. Now, the probability of that happening are really low. If you're gonna worry about that, don't worry about that. There's a lot of things to worry about in life. That's not one of them. Okay, anyway, the sixth extinction means that the anthropogenic extinctions that would come from climate change and continued conversion of habitat into agriculture to meet the demands of humanity and human population growth would create an event that big, all right? Would create an event that big. And that's worth knowing, right? This just shows how many species are now threatened. That's a mass extinction threshold. That's the KT boundary. And you can see we're all down to the left, right? That's just a little diagram showing that. I talked mostly about terrestrial habitats and not so much about fisheries. And the reason is that people can't see under the sea. So we've been really good at driving terrestrial species extinct for a long time. We started doing it when we were still hunter-gatherers and moving around into new continents, and the species stood there and we had projectile weapons and we killed them all. But the animals in the ocean, we weren't very good at exploiting. And so fishing hasn't been good until recently at driving fish species extinct. So there've been very few anthropogenic fish or marine animal extinctions. Now, nonetheless, world fish production has gone up and up and up and up, and we're getting better and better and better at seeing under the sea. Even moderately, even in moderately developed economies, all the fishing boats have sonar fish finders now, so you can actually see under the sea, right, and see where they are. As a result, the total number of fish species that are threatened has gone up through time. These are critically endangered, and these are vulnerable, but you can see it's still a small fraction of the total species, which is up here, okay? As far as I know, there's only one fish species that has gone extinct, barn door skate, I think, on the north, on the, and so it's really hard to get every last one, okay? So we haven't, but we're getting better at it. The more serious concerns about fishing come from the fact that although we're not driving the species we fish for extinct, we are driving their population sizes very low. And the ones we eat are the big ones, all right? We eat the big ones. Now, whales, we almost drove extinct, and we may have succeeded with the northern right whale in driving it extinct, just not there quite yet. But we allowed many of them to recover, but we're still hunting all the big pelagic fish. The sharks, the tuna, bluefin tuna is critically endangered because of that. And as we fish all the big species away, we're left with little ones that primarily eat zooplankton, and other predators that we don't eat, like jellyfish, explode. And so the ocean is turning from a system in which there are lots of big fish that eat fish and that who eat fish, who eat zooplankton, and who eat phytoplankton, and so on, to one in which we have many smaller things swimming around the ocean. And it's not clear what that's going to do overall to oceanic health. It certainly is less exciting to fish watch in an ocean that has been turned into a jellyfish and minnow place. On the other hand, it used to be the case that if you jumped into the Caribbean waters, like in the 1500s, if you look at Spanish logs, there are all kinds of entries like poor Diego fell into the sea and was eaten by sharks. And I can tell you right now, you can fall off a boat in the Caribbean and you will like essentially never be eaten by a shark, all right? Whereas in the old days, yeah, so I guess even that's a mixed bag. Ocean acidification is a big concern associated with global warming. CO2 in the atmosphere dissolves into the ocean, reduces the pH of the water, and makes it hard for organisms that make carbon-containing shells to actually make those shells. This is one of the contributors of the death of coral reefs worldwide. The other big one is the warming itself, which kills the coral, all right? So it's really, sadly, it's really easy to see this, right? You go to any reef in the world and it just looks terrible. Most of the time when you jump into the water, like in the Caribbean, if you've ever been there, you think, oh, this is great, right? And it's because you didn't jump in when, 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, you would have said, it was lousy relative to 50 years before that. So there's been this sort of slow, steady degradation that's hard to see during a human lifetime. A couple other little things. When people early on, you guys were most concerned about extinction loss because of the loss of ecosystem services. Okay, and ecosystem services are like what's going to actually maintain the plant cover that exchanges oxygen and carbon dioxide with the atmosphere and stuff like that. And if you actually plot ecosystem services, in this case, this is plant biomass produced in a year versus the number of species, there are tons of experimental results like this. And they show an asymptoting behavior. And they typically asymptote at something like 10 or 20 species. And so it turns out that to maintain most ecosystem functions, you don't need a lot of species. And so while this is a concern, it's not the same level. And this is why I said aesthetics were the thing that really motivates me when it comes to this. It's because of data like this, that it's kind of hard to show that we need all the species on Earth to maintain the ecosystem services that ecosystems deliver. I'm going to weaken that statement later in the course, but right now, but only weaken it, not contradict it. There are some exceptions. This is a paper by a guy named Bob Payne from 1966. Bob Payne removed individual species in the intertidal zone in Washington State and discovered that if he removed a species, the community was the same just without that species in it. Except if he removed this one starfish in the genus Phanerozoic. And then all of a sudden you went from a community of many tens of species to a community of one species. The thing kind of collapsed. There's a biodiversity collapse. And he called this a keystone species. And Phanerozoic was a top predator. All right, it's a thing that crawls around and can eat shellfish with great voracity. Now, there's a guy named Jim Estes who has pulled more and more data about this, devoted his whole career to it. He was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And what they've shown again and again and again is that removal of top predators that are disproportionately eating very little energy, right? The amount of energy eaten by a lion is very little relative to the amount fixed by the plants. Most of the energy is lost because most of the plant isn't ever eaten. It was decomposed instead. Of that which is eaten, most of the wildebeest don't get eaten by the lion and so on. So even though they only eat a little bit of the energy, these top predators tend to be the keystone species. Their removal fundamentally changes the ecosystem. This is a real surprise by people because energetically they look like the frills of the ecosystem. And yet they're the ones that actually maintain the ecosystem in recognizable form. So this is an active area of work, and it's really cool that it worked out that way. It's great for conservationists because the big fuzzy things are the ones that everybody wants to conserve. Here's some examples here. If you remove sea otters, the kelp forest collapses and becomes a thing called an urchin barren. And this has been known for some time now. Jim Estes actually worked this out. However, it turns out that then the preservation of the sea urchins restored kelp forests all over the west coast of the US, from Southern California all the way up into the Aleutians. But then about 20 years ago, there started to be reversals of the kelp forests back to urchin barrens. And you could see, if you looked at Native American middens, that there was periodic loss of the kelp forests historically, because they would switch to the urchin barren species in the midden rather than the things that were in the kelp forest that they were eating. And this has spread south. And it was a big concern. And it turns out, it looks like it's due to these things here. Now, that thing that looks like a Tyrannosaurus rex, you see those teeth there? When you think of a killer whale, you probably think of the SeaWorld killer whales, those poor, intelligent, imprisoned things that are there for your enjoyment. And they're peg-toothed things that are fish-eating. But there are two morphs of killer whale. There's the fish-eating kind, and then there's the whale-eating kind. And the whale-eating kind has a mouthful of knives, all right, just like Tyrannosaurus rex. So it turns out it looks like a pod of knife-mouthed killer whales learned that sea otters were good to eat. They'd been gone for like 200 years. And so the whales had lost track of that, okay? And you should have sort of known, because it turns out that if you take a captive sea otter that's never seen a killer whale and show it a silhouette of a killer whale, like cut it out of cardboard and paint it black, the thing freezes and won't move for like 30 minutes, like a newborn sea otter in Monterey Bay Aquarium. So they have terror of these things hardwired into their DNA, all right? And it turns out for a reason. So these things discovered that the sea otters were good to eat, and they just went moving along and ate them all. It basically ate them all, right? And so this thing is a keystone species. And it turns out without that thing there, the sea otter is a keystone species. And both of them would have been the top predator without, if this is going, the sea otter is the top predator. With the sea otter, this guy's the top predator. This is Payne system before and after starfish removal. The largemouth bass in these Michigan lakes, you artificially put a net across them, remove largemouth bass from one side, this side. It goes from nice clear water to algal infested, horrible water that you don't want to be in. This happens in coral reefs. If you fish out the big predators in a lot of coral reefs, the reef will collapse to an algal barren and won't have a beautiful coral reef anymore without the same, and with none of the invertebrate diversity. And the same, so there are many, many examples from terrestrial systems and marine systems of these sort of keystone species. And they're all top predators just about. So those are the teaching goals from this lecture. And I just want to introduce the food lecture so that we can. All right, so also while I'm doing that, would you click your eye clickers? All right, just to signal attendance. So next time I'm going to be whipping through. What do we got here? Okay. Oh, okay, great, thanks. This story, which is how to feed 9 to 10 billion people that are increasingly affluent. And the punchline is that by 2050, 30 years from now, we're going to have to increase the number of calories produced by our food system by about 60%, all right? A great big change. And so how do we do that without increasing our agricultural land? And the story has a hopeful ending because it turns out that we have the technology to do that. And with the advent of artificial meat substitutes, plant-based meat substitutes, there is the real possibility that humanity is going to find a way to substantially contract its agricultural land, all right, as these things catch on. The meat industry itself projects rapid growth in plant-based meat substitutes because they're cheaper and people want them. And that turns out to free so much pasture land that we can probably contract our agricultural lands. So that's next time, and I'll see you then.